One of the yesodot of Safrut is the din of תוכות. תוכות means that whenever you have a letter that's not shaped correctly, al pi halacha, you're not allowed to fix it by doing grida, which means you are scratching around the ink in order to give it the shape. So let's say you have a yud that doesn't have a head. Let's say the whole thing became a smudge. So you're shaping it a little bit with the knife. You're taking you're cutting off a little bit from here, from there, and you're scratching until eventually you have a shape of a yud. That's called תוכות. You're not allowed to do that. That is the halacha in Shulchan Aruch. He brings and says the following in סימן ל"ב, סעיף י"ז, אם נפלה טיפת דיו לתוך האות, ואינה ניכרת האות. You lost the shape of the letter. The letter doesn't have that shape. אין תקנה לגרור הדיו, ועל ידי כך יהיה ניכר האות. You can't scratch around the letter in order to give it the shape of the letter. Why? תוכות הוא פסול. The Torah says you have to write, וכתבתם. This is not כתיבה. This is a form of shaping up around the letter and creating a letter without the aspect of writing. משום דבעינן וכתב ולא וחקק. Okay, so there's a lot of examples to that, but the Shulchan Aruch gives the following examples. אם טעה וכתב ד' במקום רש, you wrote a ד'. Now how is a letter ד' written? ד' is written differently than a resh in the fact that a dalet has on top a akev, or even without the akev, just it's shaped as a square on top. Whenever it's shaped in a square on top, that's not a resh, that's a dalet. Dalet must be rounded on the right side on top. And therefore, if you made a square, and even more so if you made the akev, which means the head went out to the right side of the top, then that's not a resh. You're not allowed to scratch that and round it and make it look like a resh. That's called תוכות. Since right now the letter here is daled, the letter here is daled, so you can't take that and round it out by scratching here and creating a resh. That's one example of the Shulchan Aruch. הדין אם טעה וכתב ד' במקום רש, או ב' במקום כף. Same thing with a bet. Instead of doing a kaf, you took the bet and you wrote it this way. You can't scratch over here in order to round it and make it look like a kaf.
So why is adding ink not such a problem?
Because that's writing, v'katav. Ma'aseh ktiva. Okay? Now, what we want to get into is a very interesting insight of some of the Rishonim that have a totally different understanding of this din of תוכות, and we'll see how it comes lehalacha. Because when I read this in the first time, and I learned it the first time, I was wondering why the Tur and the Bet Yosef speak it out when it's a shita that doesn't come lehalacha at all, and that is the smak. The smak doesn't come lehalacha, and it's not what we posek. So why does the Tur need to bring it down? And why does the Bet Yosef needs to elaborate and brings a whole thing when it doesn't come lehalacha? But we'll see that there are nafka minot sometimes that it would come lehalacha.
Is there a reason why you say תוכות? Because it doesn't make a difference if it's tocha or chutz or why did you just say chakika asura?
No, that's because that's an example. Just like we're saying that mukaf gvil, it's not gvil dafka, because gvil is for Sefer Torah, for tefillin and mezuzot, it's not gvil, it's either klaf or chsustus. But the lashon says the mefarshim that the lashon gvil is like saying Eretz Canaan. It's not Eretz Canaan, it's Eretz of 22 amamim that was there, or Sheva amamim. And so why is it called Canaan? Evet Knaani. Evet Knaani, any slave that comes from any place. It's not yeah. Okay, so we're reading right now the Tur. כתוב וסמק, שאם נפלה טיפת דיו, קודם שנגמר האות. You started writing a letter, and it's not yet shaped of a letter. Let's say you started writing a resh. You wrote the head, and before you started writing the regel of the resh, ink fell on the head, and now it doesn't look like a head anymore. It looks like a smudge. It looks like a whole puddle of ink. That's the scenario. ולא היה אות ניכרת, ואחר כך נטל הדיו. Then you remove the dio and you fix it up. או שלא הייתה מוקפת גביל מתחילתה, פסול לה וכמו חק תוכות. So he says over here two things. First of all, he says, אם נפלה טיפת דיו קודם שנגמרה האות, which means, when is it that you have a איסור of חק תוכות, says the smak, we'll see this more clear in the continuation. אבל אם כבר הייתה עשויה כתיקונה, you made already a resh, completely, with a ראש and a רגל, ונפל בדיו, now ink fell on it and it lost the shape, יכול לתלו. You're allowed to go around it and shape it up and scratch around it and you create a resh by חק תוכות. He says, no, that's not חק תוכות because it had already the shape of a resh. Okay? So this smak is definitely not what we posek להלכה, but we'll see about that in the Bet Yosef. Now, second thing that the smak says over here, which is a chidush that also we completely, those two chidushim are completely like the opposite from what we say in halacha. That is chak tochot. Whenever you have to shape, you have to be metaken, you have to fix something, although it has the shape of letters already. Let's see how he says it. או שלא הייתה מוקפת גביל מתחילתה, פסול לה וכמו חק תוכות. Which means like this. Let's say you write a resh, and now the resh that you wrote touched the letter near it while you're writing it. So you're not allowed to scratch them, although you see the letter bet is here, the letter is resh is here, and there's a small negiah, tiny negiah between them. You're not allowed to scratch. Why? It's chak tochot, he says the smak. L'halacha, we're not posek like that. If you see the bet, you see the resh. There's two letters, there's no isur of chak tochot, and you're allowed to remove that excess ink, scratch it, and now you kosher it. But the smak calls it chak tochot. Same thing would be, let's say you write and it goes down beyond what's needed and goes out of the klaf. It completely goes out of the klaf, which means it's not mukaf gvil. You don't have around the letter completely gvil. Rather, it went all the way to the end of the klaf. Also, it's pasul, because it's not mukaf gvil. Kolot shena mukafet gvil, says the Gemara, it's pasul. So you're scratching over there. L'halacha, we're allowed to scratch it. There's no isur to scratch, even after it's written. You don't need to have in that kesidran, because it has the shape of the letter that you need. But the smak says that this is called chak tochot. You're not allowed to fix anything with scratching. Yes?
That's why I want to know if you read by two otiyot, if you ruin the letter, or even by the bottom. That's also by the...
So says the Shulchan Aruch, the Tur, ואדוני אבי הראש ז"ל פסל גם בזה, וכן כתב בספר התרומה, which means you can't fix it in such a scenario that ink destroyed the way it looks. נשחטה צורתה, that's usually the lashon they use at the Sofrim. It destroyed the letter, it made it not look anymore the shape that it should. You can't fix it anymore. That's how the Rosh says, and this is how Sefer HaTruma says, וכתב עוד שאם עשה רש כן ד' שאינו יכול, and this is the same usok. Okay, good. So we learned over here an interesting smak, and let's see now the Rashba. Now we need to know the smak and the Rashba, because the Rashba, I'm giving you heads on, the Rashba is actually, according to the way we'll see, comes le'alacha, especially for Ashkenazim. And the smak you could use sometimes for different scenarios, okay? So now, let's see how the Bet Yosef speaks out. So he brings the smak and he says, אם נפלה טיפת דיו קודם שנגמר האות, ולא הייתה האות ניכרת, you don't see the letter because the ink fell before there was a shape of the letter. What did we say? If there was no shape of the letter yet, and it lost the shape now by ink falling on it, or let's say you wrote something in it and you lost the shape. Since the shape was never there yet of the letter, you can't fix it. And it's no good. ואחר כך נטל הדיו, או כמו כן, אם לא הייתה מוקפת גביל, the second din that we said, בתחילת עשייתה, דמינן פסולה, ואחר כך נטל הדיו, וכחק תוכות הוא פסולה. אבל אם כבר, this is a חידוש נפלא, אבל אם כבר נכתבה כתיקונה, if you wrote the entire letter, you wrote the entire רש, ואחר כך נפל עליה דיו, and now ink fell on it and destroyed the way that it looks, now it doesn't look like a רש anymore. It looks like something else. It looks like stam smudge. Yitlena, kedamrinu b'Yerushalmi. The Smak tells us, where does he know this from? The Yerushalmi. So let's see where's the Yerushalmi. והירושלמי הזה, says the בית יוסף, הוא בפרק היה קורא. והכי איתה. Let's see the Yerushalmi. The בית יוסף is going to bring also a Rashba that we mentioned. הכי איתה. עירב האותיות. עירב האותיות means you mix the two letters, which means the two letters are touching. So we gave a case of, let's say, bet and a resh that were touching. If they touched each other, you wrote the bet, and then you're writing the resh, and he touched the bet. It the tani kasher, ve'it tani pasul. Seems to be two opinions, kasher or pasul. Says the Gemara that it's not a machloket. Man de tani kasher milemata, man de tani pasul milemala. Which means it depends where he touched. Anybody has a pen that I could use? Thank you. So the Yerushalmi brings and explains kegon artzenu tifartenu, which means these two words have in it in the end nun and vav. So you have a nun and a vav. Okay? Here we have a nun and a vav. Says the Yerushalmi, it depends if it's kosher or not, where it touched. If it touched on the top, over here, there was a negiah, pasul. If it touched on the bottom had a negiah, it's kasher.
You could scratch it.
The Yerushalmi doesn't say that. Let's stick to what the Yerushalmi says. On top, pasul. Touched on the bottom, kasher. Let's see again. Itahatam. Ireva otiyot, itani kasher, v'itani pasul. Two letters that touched each other. Let's stick to what the Yerushalmi brings down. A nun and a vav. Artzenu tifartenu. It touched. Some say pasul, some say kasher. Says the Yerushalmi, it's not a machloket. Man detani. Man de amar kasher milemata. If he touched on the bottom, it's kasher. Man de amar pasul milemala, כגון ארצנו תפארתנו. אבל ארצך תפארתך. You have now a different word. תפארתך, let's say. So you have in תפארתך, תף and a chaf. Taf and a chaf that touched each other. Where? Over here. In the middle of the chaf. You wrote the taf, and then you're writing you wrote the taf, then you're writing the chaf, and in the middle of the chaf, it's touching. Says the Yerushalmi, אבל ארצך ותפארתך צריכה. It's a safek. That's a real safek. Let's see the explanation of the Rashba. כתבו הרשב"א, וכתבו הרשב"א בתשובה, הוא פירש. דאחי כאמר. מלמעלה פסול, why ארצנו תפארתנו that touched on top? It's pasul, says the Yerushalmi, says the Rashba for the Yerushalmi, שעד שלא נעשה אות נפסלה צורתה. Because before you're writing the vav, already as soon as you're ready to write the vav, already touched. So it's נכתב בפסול. You wrote the letter vav בפסול. On the bottom, it's kasher because it touched after it was written already bekashrut. You had a kosher nun, you had a kosher vav, and it's touching on the bottom. While you finished it, boop, touched. The ink touched each other. Okay? But you wrote it bekashrut. אבל שנדבקו למטה נון וו של תפארתנו וארצנו, אחר שנגמרה צורת האות, הוא שנדבקה. ומתחילתה כשרה הייתה. It was kasher. Okay? So we have over here a yesod in the Rashba. If it touched on top, it's pasul because נכתבה בפסול. The vav was נכתב בפסול. So you have to scratch out the vav. The entire vav. Because the entire vav is not kosher. The bottom, if he touched on the bottom, it's kasher, it's נכתב בכשרות. ואם בא עכשיו לגרתה, אין זה כחג תוכות. If you want to scratch it, there's no חג תוכות. ולכך, says the Rashba, אפילו אינו גורד. Therefore, says the Rashba, even if you don't scratch the bottom touching the nun and the vav that touched on the bottom, even if you don't scratch, כלשהו יכול לגרד כשר. Since you could scratch it, even if you don't scratch it, it's כשר. Why? כדאמר רבי זרע. Everybody knows רבי זרע. כל הראוי לבילה, אין בילה מעכבת בו. The Gemara in Menachot says that you need to have שיעור of בילה. You need to be able, מנחת סולת בללות. You need to be able to be בולל, which means, what does it mean, בולל? To mix it. Says the Gemara brings מאמר חז"ל, that if you have 60 עשרונים and you didn't mix it, it's kosher. סתירה. You need to mix it, or you don't need to mix it. In one hand it says that it needs to be balul. In the other hand it says that even if you didn't mix it, it's kosher. So Vizera says, no, as long as it's possible to mix, even if you didn't mix, כל הראוי לבילה, אין בילה מעכבת בו. It's considered, it's good. You need to be able to do it. You don't need to actually do it. Oh, says the Smak that this is good enough because at the time you wrote, it was mukaf gvil. At the time you finished the vav, it was considered mukaf gvil. Mukaf gvil is a psul when the letter wasn't written yet, which means it touched on top or something like that. אבל ארצך ותפארתך, the second case that the Gemara says, ירושלמי צריכה, שהכף דבוקה באמצעית רגליים עד וו, צריכה, כלומר ספק. When it touched in the middle, the taf and the chaf, ארצך תפארתך, or a tzaddik here that touched the chaf, since it's touching in the middle of the resh, of the chaf, you have a safek, says the Yerushalmi. What's the safek? Since it has already somewhat the letter of the chaf up to the time it touched, maybe it's kosher. Or maybe it's not kosher because it's considered that it didn't yet touch at the end. And therefore, it's pasul. Okay? So this is a very, very interesting thing. Now, whenever you have a nun and a vav touching on top, what happens? It's a mem. Let's say it touched in the bottom and not on top. What do you have? Tet. So how is this kosher? Even according to the Yerushalmi, even according to the Rashba, how is it kosher? Shouldn't be kosher. The answer is that it's kosher because the negiah, say the mefarshim, maybe many bring it down. The Mishnah Berurah brings such a thing down, and the Keset HaSofer brings this idea down. That whenever you have a very tiny negiah, kechut ha'se'ara, it doesn't change the shape. That's the Dvar Torah that I wrote last week on the newsletter, that when you have something that's not proportional to the letter, it doesn't have a din that it's mashchit to the letter, which means like this. You have many letters in Torah that is considered the prufot, which means lefufot, which means you have a letter, let's say a vav. There's many letters like this, and they make all kind of things to it. Let's say here's a vav, and they make a crown like this, or they make something that goes like this, right? All kind of things. That should be considered definitely pasul. But it's not pasul, why not? Because since it's kechut ha'se'ara, and the shape of the letter is nikar, you see a vav, and you see something that looks like a tachshit on top of it, right? Like jewelry on top of it, something that beautifies it, gives it a nice look, and a happy look, whatever it is. Or sometimes there are different places in the Torah that the Kadmonim have different lifufim to show and express what this parasha is about, or what this pasuk is about, or what this word come to express. It doesn't make it pasul because you can see the entire letter and you have something very tiny added to it.
So why do they stop doing the fufot? It has a siba, like tagim, to be like a tachshit.
So why is no one doing it anymore?
It's a good question. Good question. But we right now are not dealing why they're not doing it. We're dealing with the question of when you have something that's so tiny that's not me'akev.
Would it save a letter? If a mem looks like that or a tet looks like that, and it has a connection?
That's a good question. Very good question. Very good question. Lichora, today, if you have such a letter with a tiny connection, it's kosher. Right? Very tiny connection, it's kosher. But we already, you have the cassette you have here. No, where's the cassette? Oh, Chazak Baruch. Chazak Baruch. So we brought from the cassette in few places. Let's see some examples that we had. You have, for example, let's say, for example, you have such a thing here. You have, he says, you have a resh like this. That's an example we wrote. See this resh? And it has a tiny quotes coming out of it. So lichora, that should change the letter to something else. You have some, because a quotes on top over here is what differentiates between, for instance, in a bet, you make that quotes to make, the reason for it, says the Mishnah Sofrim, is to, first of all, the Gemara says that the bet has a quotes to the right and to the left. The left is in order that whenever you ask the bet, Mi beracha, he says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He points out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Ma Shemo, he points out to the right, Echad Shemo. Right? But it's lehetiv et aktiva, that it's not going to look at all like a chaf. It's going to, so over here, such a quotes, he says it's not meshaneh the shape of the letter. And we brought other ideas like this, that as long as it's very tiny, it doesn't make it pasul in any way, and it's kosher. Let's see if we can find more.
But in the case of the resh, there's no other oath that you'll get confused with. It wouldn't look like any.
But that's the reason you write this, is for to differentiate that between this
and.
and.
It's round. It's not square.
By the way, there's many. Yeah. Okay. B'kitzur, that's there's many pictures here to show this idea. I'll show you another picture just to give you an idea. You have here such a thing when you have a yud touching a chaf. See that? But in the very, very tiny, so this doesn't make it into a tzaddik. Lichora, that becomes a tzaddik. If it's very, very tiny, and it doesn't, and you can clearly see the letter, so we say that it stayed with the shape of that letter, and it doesn't make it pasul in any way. There's more examples over here, but that is the idea that we're saying. Now, so this is what they bring over here, by the way. That's what they bring over here, that whenever, this is talking about such a case that the negiah is very, very tiny, and therefore it still has the shape. The nun and the chaf, or whatever it was over here, the nun and the vav still have a shape of a nun and a vav, and you wouldn't get mixed up between the two of them. Okay?
Is necessary in such a case?
Could be, if it's a safek. If you have a safek, yeah. If you have a safek. So, says the Bet Yosef, where did the Smak learn his din? The Smak that said that if you have now a letter, you wrote the yud, and after you wrote the yud, boom, ink spilled over here. Right? And now, you don't have a yud anymore. Still says the Smak that you're allowed to fix it up. You're allowed to erase around, scratch around, and leave it in the shape of a yud that it was. Where did he get this idea from? Says the Bet Yosef, נראה דסמק היה מפרש כן הירושלמי. This is the way he learned the ירושלמי. משום מה אחי כתב, אם לא הייתה מוקפת גביל בתחילת עשייתה דאמרינן דפסולה, ואחר כך נטל הדיו אבה כחג תוכות, ופסולה, כלומר שאם נדבקה עוד קודם שתיגמר, דהיינו בתחילת עשייתה פסולה, ואם נדבקה למד משם סמק לאיך שנגמרה האות. כל שנעשית כל האות בכשרות. You see from the fact that if you made the ot bekashrut, you finished the letter, they finished the vav that was right near the nun, and it was done bekashrut, shuv ena nifselet. It can't become pasul anymore. That's it. Even if nidbeka, even if it's davuk, it's connected. Lamad misham smak, the smak learned from there, lecha shenigmera ot. If the letter was finished, as we're saying, ואחר כך נפלה בדיו. It's also, a dio fell on it, it can't become pasul. יכול לתלה ולא מפסיל משום חג תוכות. Okay? So we have over here Rashba, we have a smak, and that comes out that to be something that, again, totally against what the Bavli learns, and indeed, the poskim don't go with that. They go with the Baal Truma, the Rosh, the Smag, those poskim, the Mordchi, that say that no. Two things we argue on the Smak and the Rashba. First of all, that if the letter lost its shape, you can't fix it up. It's Chak Tochot, unlike the Smak. It lost the shape, you're fixing it, it's Chak Tochot. We saw that this is how the Shulchan Aruch was posek in Yud Zayin. Secondly, if you have already the shape of the letter and it's touching in any way, like the Nun and the Vav, touching on the bottom, definitely you have to scratch in the middle. Not like the Rashba. The Rashba says you could leave it the way it is. For the Yerushalmi. Leave it the way it is. It's kol haraui lebila, and bila me'akevet bo. It's good. And on that, the Shulchan Aruch argues and says, no, it's pasul, whether it's bish'at ktiva or achar ktiva. Unlike the halacha that we say, mukaf gvil, to the end of the klaf, that if it was done bish'at ktiva, if it was done b'shat ktiva, it's pasul. If it was done achar ktiva, which means, let's say you wrote the letter correctly, and afterwards, ink fell and it's touching now, or a hole becomes that touched the letter, that's kosher, the way it is. Why? Chak tochot, mukaf gvil, in the klaf itself, not that it's touching two letters, in the klaf itself, let's say there was a hole in the klaf, is no problem if it was done after the letter was finished. But negiah, it doesn't make a difference, two letters touching, whether it was b'shat ktiva or achar ktiva. If afterwards you come to fix, you put tagim and you're touching with the tagim one letter with the other, you have to fix it up, it's not kosher. The Rashba brings down the idea of if it was done after the letter was finished, even b'shat ktiva, if the letter was finished, you can leave it as is. You don't have to worry about it. By the way, the Mishnah Berurah in the beginning of Lamed Bet brings such an opinion that maybe Meikar Adin, it would be kosher if you have two letters that are touching. When the Shulchan Aruch starts speaking about the in Seif Daled, צריך שלא תדבק שום אות בחברתה. Two letters are not allowed to touch each other. אלא כל אות תהיה מוקפת גביל. They must be separated. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ואם האות גדול ונדבק בסופו, if the letter is large enough, just like this, the nun and the vav that we just spoke about, and it's touching on the bottom, but the vav is long enough. If you take this bottom where it's touching, you scratch it off, you have enough shiur. Says the Mishnah Berurah, אם האות גדול ונדבק בסופו באופן שאם נגרר מה שדבק מכל מקום יישאר צורת אות, יש מכשירים ויש פוסלים. It's מחלוקת. But there are מכשירים and say that that's the way it is. Who's that yes מכשירים? The Rashba. So you see that the Mishnah Berurah brings the Rashba, יש מכשירים ויש פוסלים. He brings that Rashba down להלכה. He says, יש מכשירים ויש פוסלים. הסכימו האחרונים להחמיר. Which means, the Achronim say that no, one should not allow such a thing. But he brings that as an opinion, la halacha. And could be, if you want to be מדייק in the לשון of the משנה ברורה, if you could, להחמיר, it doesn't say הסכימו האחרונים לפסול. יש מכשירים ויש פוסלים, והסכימו האחרונים, you should have said לפסול. He says להחמיר. It's not such a stark לשון, it's not very strong. So could be, that's another tzad over here, that one could take that Rashba, halacha למעשה, something that's worth keeping in mind. Says the כסת הסופר. כסת הסופר is in סימן, end of סימן ח'. סימן ח', סעיף ט"ו. אם נדבק אות לאות, two letters touch each other, ולא נתקלקל צורתו, the shape of each letter is still there, אלא כל אחת מצורתו עליה, just like we spoke over here. אם נעשה הדיבוק קודם שנגמר האות, if the touching was before you finish the letter, אין להתיר לגרור את הדיבוק לבדו. You can't just erase the touching in the middle. אלא בשעת הדחק כגון באות מן השם. Unless it's שם השם. So then you can't erase the entire letter. ונראה לי דועדין בתפילין ומזוזות שכתב להלן שלא להצליחה כניסה. Also another thing that you could be lenient is if you continued writing in תפילין ומזוזות, so now if you say that touching in the top, or touching wherever it was, if you have that touching and you continue to write and you can't erase anymore, you're going to have to put the tefillin in the mezuzah and the gniza. So it says no. Over here will be mekel, either in Shem Hashem or tefillin mezuzot that you wrote already. אבל שלא בשעת הדחק, if you didn't continue writing the tefillin mezuzot, you write there where it's touched, or it's Sefer Torah that you could fix, because you don't need to have כסדרן in Sefer Torah, you could go back and fix wherever it is. צריכים לגרור כל האות השני שנדבק לחברו. You have to erase the entire letter. הלכה למעשה in the כסת הסופר. אבל אם נעשה הדיבוק לאחר שנגמר האות, but if the touching was in the end of the letter, that's just like the nun and the vav that touched on the bottom, כגון vav אצל נון, ונדבקה vav למטה אצל הנון, יכולים לגרור את הדיבוק לבדו. All you need to erase is the bottom. ואין בזה חג תוכות, מכיוון שכבר צורת האות נגמרה קודם שנדבקה, והמחמיר גם בזה לגרור כל הוו תבוא עליו הברכה. So what are we learning over here? That he brings the Rashba הלכה למעשה, לחומרה. לחומרה in both ways, in other words, in the aspect of כל הראוי לבילה, אין בילה מעכבת בו, which means you can leave it the way it is because it touched on the bottom, that he says no, you have to erase it. Because we posek להלכה like the Bavli, not like the Yerushalmi, that you don't say כל הראוי לבילה אין בילה מעכבת בו, you have to erase it, and each one has to be mukaf gvil, completely, even though it touched after it had a shape of a letter. But concerning the din that it touched on top, now the letter vav was written bepsul. According to the Shulchan Aruch, there's no difference. It has a din of a letter, it has a look of a letter, it's good. Doesn't make a difference that it was nichtav bepsul. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't have this idea that it's nichtav bepsul. But, says the Keset HaSofer, that we do say that it's nichtav bepsul. Now, by the way, just to mention this, that this halakha that we're learning from the Shulchan Aruch, that it's permitted and it's not considered nichtav bepsul, and all you have to do is scratch over there. אם גרר והפרידה, says the Shulchan Aruch, kasher ולא מקרחה תוכות, and you can do this wherever it is. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't take the Rashba להלכה. Says the ביור הלכה on this very הלכה in סעיף י"ח, דיבור המתחיל ואם. The ביור הלכה says the following, אף אם נעשה הדבקות קודם שנגמר האות, you have to be מגרד. He says, אף אם נעשה הדבקות קודם שנגמר האות. עיין בביאור הגר"א בספר שערי אפרים למערי מרגליות, דדין זה שולחן ערוך יש לפקפק בו, ומוכח שם מדעת שערי אפרים בתחי שערים שלו, שאין להקל בו, אלא בתפילין ומזוזות כבדיעבד דמי, just like the כסת הסופר, which means the ביאור הלכה brings down for אשכנזים, כסת הסופר, unlike the שולחן ערוך, that you have this idea that you can't continue writing, you have to fix, there's a נגיעה, you have to stop, you just made a נגיעה with another letter, or with the letter itself in a place that you shouldn't touch, you have to stop. Stop right now, wait for it to dry. It takes time. It takes 10 minutes for it sometimes to dry if there's a nice amount of ink. So it delays your writing very much. And you have to wait for it to dry, erase the whole letter that was touching, the second letter, not the first one, that was nichtav b'kashrut. The second one was nichtav b'kashrut. And then after you erase it, you fix it, and you can continue writing. That's not considered kadiavad. Only b'tfilin u'mezuzot that you continued writing, and you can't erase anymore because you have now Shem Hashem, so you can't erase Shem Hashem to go back, that's considered kadiavad dami, in order not to put it in the geniza. דאם היה צריך מחיקה, היה נפסל משום שלא כסדרן. הספר תורה וכן תפילין ומזוזות, אם לא כתב עדיין התיבות שאחר זה, לא מהנגרירת הדבקות לבד. אם נדבק קודם שנגמר האות וגמר האות בפסול. You wrote it שלא בכשרות, you wrote it בפסול. And therefore, since we חושש for that רשב"א, להלכה, you can't continue writing. So this comes out, הלכה, למעשה, very interesting. And this is how the כסת הסופר is פוסק, but in this sefer over here, Mishnat HaSofer, Rav Stern, he brings down over here some understandings that we need to know. First of all, he says that you need to know that the second letter that was nifsal, it was nifsal when you wrote all bektiva achat. That's when you need to erase the entire letter. Let's say you're writing a vav. So vav is written bektiva achat, and once it's touched, you have to erase the entire letter. It was nichtav bektiva achat. But let's say you wrote a daled the way they write today the daled. Today it used to be meikar hadin. They write daled in one ktiva, which means you write just a letter that's on an angle. You start writing like this. It's one time. You don't have to pick up the ink. The quill. Right? That's a daled. So you write it in one time. Today, they do two times. They pick up the quill, they pick up the kulmus, since the daled is written in two times. One time you make a line on top, the head, and then you write the yerech. You write the leg in two times. So let's say the yerech was touching and not the head. So all you need to erase is the daled, not the entire letter, right? He says that b'pashtut. Secondly, it depends where it's touched. If you take a look, there's a difference between the smak and the rashba. The smak considers the entire thing until the letter is completed, ink, dio be'alma. This is the lashon of the rashba, by the way, and this is the lashon of the Bet Yosef. The Bet Yosef says, according to the smak, he says, צריך לגרור כל האות הנדבקת. Which means even before it has a shape of the letter according to the smak, he says you have to erase the entire ink. And this is how the Bach says, Kol shelo nikar haot haveledio be'alma. You started writing a letter. You started writing, let's say, a vav. And you got up to here. You got up to here. There's no shape of a letter yet. It doesn't look like a vav. Now, some psul happened to it. It touched another letter on your writing. So this is called dio be'alma. According to the smak, the whole thing is no good. You have to erase the whole thing, says the Shulchan Aruch. The Bet Yosef. צריך לגרור כל האות הנדבקת. But according to the Rashba, you only have to erase from the place that it became pasul. From here on. But the top
does it have Surat Ha'ot
even if it doesn't have Surat Ha'ot. By the way, if you took a look at the Mishnah Berurah, it brings a machloket, the Bet Yosef and the Darkei Moshe with the Radach. He says the Bet Yosef and the Darkei Moshe say that this has a din, a kosher. It's kosher as long as it's finished, which means, let's say a letter became, you have ink that fall on top of a cloth. Let's say the ink fell in this shape. You have ink that fell like this. This is ink. This ink just fell. So this is not v'katav. You didn't write anything. The ink fell. and it happened to have a shape like this, let's say. Can you finish it? You need a vav. Can you finish it? Right now it's not a vav. It doesn't have a shape of a vav. Can you finish it or not? Says so the Mishnah Berurah brings down in Seif Katan Samech Zayin, towards the end, that according to the Bet Yosef and the Darkei Moshe, as long as you finished the letter with Ktiva, it's considered V'katav. Ktiva, which means we make, and the Radach says no, it needs to be the entire thing, which means you could have a Chakira. That's how they like to say it in yeshivas. The Chakira. What is considered a letter? Is a letter considered when it's finished? That's when it gets a Shem letter? Or a letter needs to be from beginning till end? You need to write the entire letter, only Maise Make Bepatish makes it into a letter. Yeah, now we can understand. Oh, Machlokes, the Darkei Moshe with the Beis Yosef and the Radach.
According to that, if you erase, would the second part?
You can do whatever you want until, according to that, you can do whatever you want until it has a din of a letter. Which means before it's a vav, before it's considered a vav, you didn't have yet the two kulmusim on the bottom. Two kulmusim is the size that you need to have in order to be machshir the yud, the vav. You need to have kulmus on top, shiur kulmus, and shnei kulmusim, two kulmusim over here. Let's say you made only one kulmus. You can do that b'chak tochot. You can do that with the ink that falls on the top. You can do it however you want. You just need to finish it. Let's see it inside. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Im nafla ala klaf tipat dio. Ink fell on top of the klaf. V'nasa kemin chatziot. Half a letter was created from that ink. Lo shari להשלים האות על ידי כתיבה. והבית יוסף והרמה מקילים אפילו בזה הדין האחרון. The בית יוסף and the רמה are lenient on that. סוברים זה לא מכרחק תוכות, אלא שגומר האות על ידי חקיקה. אך, but the Radach argues, and he says it's not kosher. האחרונים מצדדים להחמיר בזה הדין האחרון, אם לא שמושך טיפת הדיו ההלכה ומזיזה ממקום למקום, עד שעושה עוד שלם דעה וכתיבה. Which means, according to the האחרונים, a person should be מחמיר like the Radach. But everybody would agree it would be fine if when it fell, the ink over here, you take the kulmus, you take the quilt, and you start moving the ink a little bit. Here to here, you create with that the din of katav. The katav, and that would be kosher and fine. Okay? But now I want to tell you some nafkaminas with the Radach, which is very interesting. In the Mishnah Berurah, in Seif Yudchet, he brings down a long Mishnah, a long biur halacha, starts with the dibur matchil im Yudchet. And he speaks about over here that a kuf, a kuf is not kosher דיבור המתחיל רגלי, not im, רגלי. A kuf is not kosher if the leg of the kuf is touching the head. That we know. Although it's a מחלוקת ראשונים, but it's not kosher. That's what we posek להלכה. Says the ביור הלכה, in this ביור הלכה, in סעיף י"ח, דיבור המתחיל רגלי ההי, that even if it's touched kechut ha'se'ara, even the tiniest touch, it's not kosher. And this is something that we need to keep in mind because it's common. That you have kechut ha'se'ara touching. Sometimes the shofar misses it because it's kechut ha'se'ara and you see it. Now what you see? Can you fix it? L'halacha, you can't fix it. But he brings over here an idea like this. He says that במקום הדחק ואין תקנה במחיקת האות, כגון שכתב שם הקודש אחר זה, ובידוע שנעשה נגיעה דקה זה אחר שנגמר האות בהכשר, if the letter kuf, again, let's make a picture of that. The letter kuf.
Wouldn't it make a difference if you make the regular from bottom to top or top to bottom, or no?
Yes,
Oh.
we're going to see. The letter kuf is not supposed, the leg is not supposed to touch. מחלוקת ראשונים, we spoke about this in the past, but להלכה we posek that if it touches even כחוט השערה, it's not kosher. Says over here, what if it's בשעת הדחק? That you can't fix it, and you don't have an ability to have another pair of tefillin, and it was done after the letter was finished, which means you wrote it בכשרות. This negiah happened afterwards.
Usually
Says-
you have a suffix. You don't know when it happened.
Says the biur halacha. No, but let's say you're fixing the tefillin, and all of a sudden your ink, boom. כחוט השערה משהו. ובידוע שנעשה, ידוע, you need to have ידיעה. ידוע שנעשה נגיעה דקה זו אחר שנגמר עוד בהכשר, אפשר שיש לצרף דעת הסמק. That what? That he says once it's kasher, you don't have an ability to be posel that anymore. It's kasher the way it is, and you could fix it. Also, if you take a look, it's interesting. This idea that you just said yourself is something that the halacha bura brings down in this same seif. It brings down I'll tell you which seif katan, pei hey. He says the following: אם בשעה שכתב הסופר אות ה' או אות ק', the way we mentioned right now, כתב הרגל השמאלית מלמטה למעלה. If you started, normally you always go from the top bottom, but let's say you started the other way. Now you have a letter in kashrut. Before it touches here, it has a kosher leg, right? והאות ניכרת שיהיה ה' או ק', again, וכשסיים כתיבת כל הרגל נטבחה על רגל הגג האות כחוט השערה. A little bit touched. והאות ניכרת שהיא ה' או ק'. That's the case of the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah spoke about afterwards. He speaks about even at the time you're writing, but you're writing from the bottom to the top. יש להקל בהפרדת הרגל מן הגג. He allows you to disconnect it, to scratch it. ואין צריך למחוק כל הרגל ולכתבה מחדש. Why not? He says over here, interesting. He says, you have over here three ספקות. What are the ספקות? היינו משום שבזה יש לצרף שיטת הסמק. That the Mishnah Berurah brought down. שיטת הסמק, it was written בכשרות, so it's כשר. You כשר. והיכא שנכתב בכשרות ואחר כך נדבקו אותיות, כגון שנדבקו בשעת סיום כתיבת האות, אין בזה משום חג תוכות. אוקיי? Second, וכתב הרשב"א שאף אין צריך להפריד הדיבוק. The Rashba goes even as far as since it's ראוי לבילה, you don't even need to fix it. And secondly, שמא אין צריך מעיקר הדין שתהיה רגל הה' או הקוף נפרדת מן הגג. We already spoke that this is a מחלוקת ראשונים, that some say if it's touching the gag, that's the way it should be written לכתחילה. And you can see from the Gemara that it says that Safrut davkane, the daikanim, those sofrim that were medaikim, writing extra special, extra kosher, super kosher, they went out of the way to make it more kosher than it's needed, like machmir. They would separate the leg of the hay and the kuf from the head. Which means, according to the simple understanding of the Gemara, some Rishonim say, that it's only Safrut davkane, which means it's not requirement, it's only a chumrah. But if you made a touch on top, and the kuf, the letter kuf is nikar, to a tinok, he sees a kuf, even though it's touching. Or even a hey, touching on top, but it's a tiny touching. And therefore, it doesn't change the shape of the hay. Normally, if it's touched on top, it makes it into a chet, right? But if you have this is a hay, and over here it's very, you see, again, you take a look in perspective in relation to everything else. You have large evarim, large limbs, and a small negiah on top. So this is the Safrut davkane that would make sure that it doesn't touch. But it's only a chumrah of the Safrut davkane. That's how some learn. L'halacha we not posek like this. We posek that even if it touches kechut ha'se'ara, we said now, pasul. But that's another din that's safek. So you have over here few ספקות to be מצרף. יש 3 ספקות להקל. שמא אין צריך מעיקר הדין שתי רגל הה' או הקוף נפרדת מן הגג. ואם תמצא לומר שתריך שתהיה נפרדת, שמא במחוברת כחוט השערה, שפיר דמי להפרידן. That's a second opinion that it's כחוט השערה. It's a מחלוקת, כחוט השערה. The ביור הלכה, this ביור הלכה that I just mentioned, brings down over there opinions, and I say is מחמיר. But there are opinions in that. And even if you hold the third ספק, ואם תמצא לומר אף נדבקו כחוט השערה לא מעני הפרדה משום חג תוכות, שמא נכתבו בכשרות לקה משום חג תוכות, as we mentioned from the smak, right? So that's something interesting. Now, if you take a look, he brings down, interestingly, the halacha brura, that whenever a letter was touched at the time of the writing, you should erase that letter before you continue writing. The same way the posek lagerash, Shulchan Aruch didn't bring that at all. But he says, let's say you write the aleph. The aleph is written, how many evarim you have in a letter? Aleph, 3. You have the yerech, and you have nekuda elyona, ונקודה תחתונה. You have the yerech, the leg, נקודה עליונה, which is considered the yud עליונה, and נקודה תחתונה. Why is it called נקודה? The Gemara in Menachot, Kaftet, the Tosfot brings over there, the Gemara and Sanhedrin, I think, לפי עניות דעתי, I think that's the idea. It says over there that תינוק זורק על הקיר, ויוצא רושם בעלמא, that's a yud, says the Gemara over there. That roshem be'alma, it's a little bit of spot that the kid took, let's say he took mud or he took ink, he threw it on the wall, there's some kind of roshem be'alma, some kind of spot on top, that's considered roshem be'alma. So it could be that's called the yud, and that refers to the yud. Could be that's called nekuda, that's what it's called. Can sein. So, lemaise, he's machmir, that if, let's say, the aleph was written, and while you're writing, so you first wrote the yerech, that's normally the way it's done, and then you write yud elyona, and let's say, while you're writing the yud elyona, it touched the yerech. It became pasul. And then you write yud tachtona, let's say. He says, no, you have to erase the yud tachtona, yud elyona, and then rewrite it. The yerech you don't have to erase, because nichtav bekashrut. But yud tachtona was nichtav shelo bekashrut. Yud elyona you had over there touching. That's no good. But he's machmir like that. But let's take a look at the Kaf HaChaim. The Kaf HaChaim in Siman Lamed Bet, Seif Peichet, brings down the following. He brings from what the Shulchan Aruch says, that mem ptucha shenidbak ptichatav nistema. You write a mem. So when you write a mem, if the mem, how is the mem written? Well, it's built of 2 letters. What are they? What? Chaf Vav. So the Mishnah Berurah brings down in Mishnah Sofrim, and this is how the Bet Yosef says from the Alpha Beta, from the Baruch She'amar, which is the Alpha Beta, in Lamed Vav, that it's written with Kaf and a Vav. That's how the Shulchan Aruch brings down in the Bet Yosef. But in the Shulchan Aruch himself, in Seif Yudchet, he says that it's a nun. Over here, Mem Ptucha Shenidbak Ptichatav Nistema. It becomes Satum on the bottom, which means on top it's touching. And then it becomes Satum on the bottom, something touched over here. It becomes a Mem Stuma. But what is the top? Nun or a Chaf? He says the Lashon like this. Mata kanta, שיגרור כל החרטום ותישאר כצורת נון כפופה. How do you fix this if it's touched on the bottom? You have to erase the Vav, and you have left first with a Nun. What is it? A Nun or a Chaf? Is it a Nun or a Chaf? What is this? In the Bet Yosef he writes, in Tzurat Otiyot it's a Chaf. Over here he calls it a Nun. That's one of the Re'ayot that the Shulchan Aruch had the Sefer Torah in Ktav Valish. Because in Ktav Valish, you take a look in the Mor V'Ktsiah, he writes over there, and in David Emet for the Chida, he writes that the letters for Sfaradim, Mem is made of Nun and a Vav. The Ashkenazim, the Bet Yosef, brings down Chaf and Vav. Why? Because in the Bet Yosef, he just brought what he found, as he said, in the Baruch She'amar, which is the Alpha Beta. But is he posek like that? No. Take a look at the Shulchan Aruch. The way he's posek, it's a Nun and a Vav. Okay, that's another. That's one raya that the Bet Yosef had the Sefer Valish. It's pashut that he did, because we said already that his rabbi had ktav. We have writing from him that was Ktav Valish, right? Okay, So he says like this. He says the Kaf HaChaim in Seif Katan Peichet. He says, from the get פשוט he brings down, נראה לי מה שכתבו מעריב בן חביב וכן הסכים מרן בית יוסף, דגרור החרטום של המם. Whenever you touch like this, you have to erase the entire חרטום של המם. You have to erase the חרטום, the top of the mem. והיינו לצאת ידי חובת תשובת הרשב"א, in order to be מחמיר like the רשב"א. Again, we take the רשב"א להלכה. דסביר על ידי צריך לגרור הצער הדבוק, כגון רגל של קוף, וכף שנדבקו, אין צריך למחוק אלא הרגל, כי הגג כדין נכתב, but you have to erase the רגל, whatever was written בפסול. And then he says, אמנם להראש, אפשר דסבירה לשאף וגירת הדבק לא סגי, מכל מקום שימחוק מקצת עד שיפסיק צורת המם, יפסיד צורת המם מאיזה מקום שיהיה, או צורת הנון מצד התחתון, חוזר ומשלימה, that's good enough, that's all good enough. Which means, according to the ראש, you just have to make sure, it doesn't make a difference, you don't have to take off whatever was written בפסול. You have now something that's not kosher, take something out to make it not look anymore like a mem. You can take it from the nun, from the chaf. You can take the bottom, the entire bottom, it doesn't look anymore like a mem when you took out the entire leg over here. That's how the Rosh says. So the Kaf HaChaim ends up and says like this, listen to the words. כל זה שכתבנו הוא למצוא סמך על מנהגנו פה בגדד. This is a סמך, this is a לימוד זכות, or a סמך, more than לימוד זכות, סמך, a support, for those that don't do as the Rashba, don't do as the כסת הסופר, don't do as the ביאור הלכה brings down, don't do any of that. שאין מקפידים למחוק כל נכתב בפסול, אלא גוררים מאיזה מקום שיהיה עד שיפסל צורתו, ומשלימים על ידי זה הכתיבה. So להלכה, he says, that's good enough. That's the minhag in Baghdad, that's the minhag הספרדים, that's it. But then he ends up and says, אבל כל ירא וחרד על דבר השם, לא יזוז מדברי מרן והאחרונים שכתבו צריך לגרור כל נכתב בפסול. So, there is such a thing, מיועך שלא אפשר, יש לסמוך על המנהג. It's interesting that he says, כל ירא וחרד על דבר השם. When other places the poskim bring down that a person is not allowed to come close to the malacha of Safrut unless he's yareh v'chared el Hashem. So what does that mean over here? Those that are not yareh and chared el Hashem can do whatever they want, but those, although it's, even since it's kasher la'alacha, but those that are yareh v'chared el Hashem should not do that, should do the chumrah of the Rashba. So where do you have those that are not yareh v'chared el Hashem that come samuch lemelacha and they do such a thing of Safrut? That's we can. Can't be such a cipher around. So that will have a shiur, that will have to dedicate a shiur by itself, but this is for today. Chazak v'ruch.